Well, hello,
Yes.
welcome to the Friday film. It's our film on a Friday. That's it, really. Anyway, I'm here today with Simon J, who's up here. I don't know where I am on your screen, and
Uh-huh.
we're going to be talking about racism. Now, when we first did this as a woke month thing, we were going to call it something else, but then I thought let's just call it what it is, and we'll talk about what it is. So we're talking about racism and the way it permeates lots of things. But do you want to introduce yourself first, Simon, and then we'll see where we end up.
Yeah, sure. Um, Thank you for having me. So my name is Simon J. I am what I call myself a pioneer Baptist minister. Now, the reason why I say pioneer in front is that I don't technically look after a church congregation. Um, a lot of my role is looking after other ministers who are doing some very interesting stuff out there on the fringes, on the margins, and stuff like that. So again, a lot of them don't also look after what you think of as a church congregation, but they're developing like kingdom of heaven principles in places and spaces that you don't find a lot of other Christians at work in. So it's really interesting. So that's why I call myself a pioneer. I live in Birmingham. I've been running a charity for 23 years, working in one of our neighborhoods here in Birmingham. And final thing to say about me, I am a foster dad, been fostering young people and kids for, again, over 20 years with my wife, Rachel. So that's me. Quick
Okay,
introduction.
that'll do for starters. I mean, one of the reasons we've asked you along is because you're also a thinker and a theologian, aren't you? You don't just kind of wander about doing stuff like me. You actually think about it as well. So it's good to have someone who's considered some of these things. Uh,
Hmm.
so one of the kind of ways we approach this, because in a sense, racism is quite a sensitive subject, and I found when we bring it up, people react very strangely. Often, particularly white people, um, and particularly white people over a certain age, get very offended at the very thought that they might be racist, and so they won't
Mhm.
even consider it. And the other response is, well, you're just trying to make us all feel guilty. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
not actually. I'm just trying to think about what's going on. So it's been an interesting subject to bring up because partly we don't want just the shutters coming down. Well, let's talk about racism. I'm not racist. You're just trying to make me make out I am, so I'm not talking about it. We've been trying to find a way in, really, to talk about attitudes and the way people are treated and how history affects us. So that wasn't
Absolutely.
really a question, although it may have started as one.
Yeah. So I think I want to start at looking at this word racism. I think that would be a really good way
Okay.
in. Before I do, right, I just need to. I've got my cat here.
Oh, I
He's,
like cats. Cats
yeah,
can
he's
be
actually.
people.
I'm actually gonna have to lock him out the room because he's like wanting cuddles and he's distracting me. Right, racism. So I think the word race and the word racism has now become very problematic. I think it's become problematic for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is I think that when you mention the word racism, it conjures up a whole wide range of different thoughts and understandings of what we're actually talking about here. So you can get somebody who's thinking from one perspective and another person who's thinking from another perspective about this same word. And then they sort of like clash. So someone says, I'm not racist. I'm not racist because whatever. And I think our understanding of racism now is very unhelpful. I want to pull us back to what I personally believe we are talking about at the center of racism, and that is it's about power and unbalanced power dynamics. I think the center point of, if you like, this term racism is living in a world, in a community where if you are black, your very sort of like entrance into the scene, you are disadvantaged because of the color of your skin. it's not for me, it's unhelpful when we jump straight to an individual perspective of it. When we say,
Right.
your race is because you said a certain word, your race is because it's our structures and it's our systems that disadvantage Black people. And I think that the challenge for white people, if you like, you're going to use these very sort of like pluralistic, dualistic, sorry, expressions. The challenge for white people is for them to understand the privilege that they have within our current structures and systems. That's the challenge. So I wouldn't necessarily say, I wouldn't say that a white person is racist, but what I would say is that a white person within our current world structures and systems, our economic systems, our social systems, and stuff like that, our educational systems, our health systems, our law systems, if you are white, you are less likely to be disadvantaged within those systems itself. If you understand that, then you may live your life differently according to that. Does that make a bit of sense? Have I
It
just
does,
gone
and it's
off on one?
yeah. I've heard about 20 questions went off as we were going along there. I mean, one of them. So are we talking particularly about the West now, our part of the world? Because the trouble is, there's. I know that the conversation's bigger, isn't it? Because globally, the last 5 or 6 centuries have had a massive impact globally. But when we talk about systems, are we talking at this point particularly about sort of Europe, Western sort of
Yeah, so
civilization?
I'm gonna go into those systems a bit more. The other thing I want to mention, which I think is a very sad thing, coming back to the word racism, is the word racism is now too generic. So we use the word racism for any sort of, if you like, injustice or discrimination to for any people group. So
Yeah,
you are Jew, you can experience racism. If you're a Black person, you can experience racism. If you're Asian, you can experience racism. Indigenous experience racism. Australian Aborigine, sorry, and stuff like that. And I think what's happened is we've lumped white people in one column and the rest of the world in another box.
yeah,
And the problem with that is it then fails to see our unique stories. So as a Black person descended from Africa and from the slave trade that went over, the transatlantic slave trade, my experience and feeling is completely different from a Jewish person that has had to come to terms with the Holocaust. Yet
yeah,
we are put into the same boat, but we have two completely different stories. And I think that that is one of the another problematic things when we're talking about racism. So in this conversation, when I'm talking to you about racism, what I'm specifically doing is I'm talking to you about the effects of the transatlantic slave trade and
right.
how that has affected me as a Black person whose father was um, uh, born in the Caribbean and whose ancestors came from Africa that got taken across from Africa on a slave ship to then work a system of slavery to build economic advantage for white people and then have come across to this country and we are still living with the effects of that. So I'm very specific when I
Yeah,
talk to you
I
about
mean, and
racism.
that's I think partly where you have to put the work in, don't you? Because I think it's well, we've had conversations where you have white people saying, "Well, I've experienced racism. People, Black people have said this to me or whatever," and I don't always quite know how to respond, because my take and my learning as I'm learning as I go along is that racism is more about systems and cultures of behavior rather than just me not
Yeah.
liking you because you're different. So that's a good point. But the trouble I think for people is that you've got to start nuancing it, haven't you? And that doesn't work. It particularly in our culture, we don't like nuance. This is good, that's bad. This we should do, that you shouldn't do. You said this, therefore you mean this very narrow. So it's really hard to start saying, well, it's different. But I think we have to do that. And that's partly why we're trying to open up this conversation. And I think particularly for white people, I remember this is a bit of a confession for me. I'm not sure if I told you this. When I was in training, equal ops was kind of coming into fashion at that point. It's when political correctness was around, and then that became a negative. It just as woke popped up, and then it became seen as a negative kind of thing. But I remember at that point, and this isn't a value statement at all. Basically, we had black people would come in and tell white people how terrible they are, and that was the training. And that's my take on it. And I understand my take on it. That's from a very privileged position. And I chose not to go, much to my shame now, actually. And I confess that. But I mean, this is also gets into other things like tone policing and stuff, doesn't it? So anyway, we're pick something out of that or talk about something completely different. It's up to you.
No, exactly. I think that, see, that's the challenge, isn't it? I think so. I am just to reflect on, the feeling of being a white person, being told how awful you are. I am British. That is part of my. I'm actually mixed dual heritage. My mum is a white person. My dad is a black person. So part of who I am also comes from that history of white Europeanness. And I have to somehow make sense of some of the stuff that Britain has been involved in that has not been good
Yeah,
throughout the years. The the colonization, and we're going to come on and talk about decolonizing, the colonization of so many beautiful cultures, and the destruction of those cultures, or the watering down of those cultures, is something that as a British person I am proud of. However, within that sense of not being proud of, there's a lot of things that I am proud of, you know, in terms of being British. But it's so conflicted, because we still have within this country of ours, we still have, what we call the far right, that creates certain images associated with Britain, like the Union Jack, that then it conflicts you, because you're
yeah,
just like, well, I want to be able to hold up my Union Jack at the Olympics and support our British, support my British sports people. Yet at the same time, that same image I'm seeing being held up by people who are incredibly violent and racist. So I feel conflicted. I can
yeah.
imagine that, again, that confliction of the goodness and the badness of our culture, of our history, in one sense lies within all of us. I think there's this term called, I don't know what you think of this term, but it's called white fragility. And that's really
Yes,
what you're talking about.
yes,
It's that it's that I it's the idea of how, when a white person hears something of a historical nature that that's very much narrated in the terms of white, then the fragility of that white person comes out, and that's where the defensiveness becomes, or the reacting against it comes, because it's like, I'm
that's the bit I
struggling.
find most amusing when you look at the kind of anti woke type people, is that they go on about everyone being offended all the time, and and the thing is, they're the ones who are generally being they're the fragile one. They that's the irony. People call me a snowflake, but actually, I don't care if you wear a poppy or have a union flag or whatever. I don't care. Do what you want. Celebrate Diwali or be an atheist. I don't care. Do what you want. But there's well, that's not British, and yet they're saying, well, look, you're being. It is that fragility about And I think here's my take on it is that it's because they don't really know who they are. I think people have lost what it means to be British. They've forgotten,
Yeah,
so they just cling on, usually for some bizarre reason, to World War One images seems to be the fixed point.
yeah,
It's a bit like what's that? The people in America that only use horse-drawn carts, they decided that's the point in history when it
yeah,
stopped. And
yeah.
this group of people seem to think, well, World War One, that was Britain at its best for some reason. I don't quite get it.
Yeah, you know, 100%, absolutely. So I think in terms of before we start talking about the decolonization of
Yes,
things, I think it's so for me, I think, you know, it's important that what we're focusing on here, although we're using the word racism, which is a very problematic word anyway, because again, a history of that the word race came about because we try to categorize the human race. So there's only one race. It is the human race. And
yes,
I'm not sure we are aware of any Martians, but you know, if we want to be really pedantic about it, unless we get alien races coming in here, then racism is a bit of a mute system. Anyway,
yes,
but it's when we decided that we were going to categorize different levels of humanness that then racism became a word that started to build traction. Because obviously you had people who were fully human, and there were several um, sort of like categories that were fully human. And then you had the Negroids, which were categorized, which again were, you know, people of African descent. And
but even the
they were
language there.
categorized.
Sorry to interrupt, but I will keep doing it anyway. I mean, you can.
You
It's
tackle.
the word negroid. Even that
Yeah.
makes it sound like it's something else, doesn't it? The language itself is used to distance
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
those people.
exactly. Exactly. So they were categorized as being less than human. So
Yeah,
now you've suddenly got you've suddenly created a new race, a non-human or a less than human race. Hence why we have that word. So we're dealing with language that straight away isn't helpful.
yeah,
Hence why I you know I would love to get rid of the word racism. I really would. You know, it'd be a tricky thing to do. And what I would like to do is for each group or people group over history that is still living with the consequences of oppression and injustice, I'd like to enable them to be able to tell their own story in their own right.
yeah.
Um, I, so the story that we're telling when we're talking about the word racism is again the story of the transatlantic slave trade and
So was
current
that where the
effects.
word racism first was started to be used? That period of colonization, is that when people started to justify behaviors? Because I remember you talked a bit about this when you were with us.
Yeah,
Is that was a deliberate decision?
it was a deliberate
Because
decision.
before that point,
It was
everyone was people, weren't they? We were just people, whatever country you're from. Yeah,
100% deliberate decision. It was claimed to be a scientific piece of work that was done. Obviously, it wasn't, but it was claimed to be scientific that wanted to show that we were biologically different. Um, and yeah, and that was it really. So we created you know we created these sections, one of which were Caucasians, the Europeans mainly, and another section of people were obviously the Negroids, and you had a few other sections as well. But it was claimed that therefore we can justify a biological difference between people groups, which enabled us to justify the way that we dehumanized certain of these
mm.
biological things. So that was a separation. Obviously, all rubbish. There is no biological difference from a human point of view between me, between you, between Rishi Sunak, between anybody that's human within on the planet Earth. We literally would have to come from Mars or another planet
it's
to have
almost
a
this
bio.
idea of the civilized and the savage, isn't there? That's another way it's categorized, isn't it? These people are
Yeah,
savages, and that's still knocking around that idea of the jungle. Everyone wears furs. You know, if you live in on
yeah,
the continent of Africa, you live in this beautiful jungle. It must be lovely eating coconuts, all that stuff. That's still knocking around
yeah,
in films and in books, and it's just a bizarre kind of
yeah.
way of viewing the world, isn't it?
Well, it makes sense if what you're wanting to do is if you're wanting to treat somebody in a certain way, it makes sense to story them
Hmm.
as a savage, which brings us nicely to decolonizing
Okay, that's good, isn't it?
our church services.
Seamless.
Um,
And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for today. This conversation we had went on, so we're breaking it up. So next time we're going to pick up or dig a bit deeper into what does it mean to decolonize our thinking. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next Friday.